a topic which has already come up for scrutiny several times this weekend, to do with the new restrictions which are being put on the availability of natural health products. And you've already heard, some of you, Ian Crane speaking about it earlier in the weekend. I referred to it myself, and there's a lot of concern that the freedom of choice in a lot of areas of life is being taken away from us. Now, Robert is the head of the Alliance for Natural Health and has been doing sterling work in trying to keep that freedom of choice alive. And he's going to speak today about what's going on, what we can do about it, and what he's been trying to do about it. So I give you Mr. Robert Verkerk. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues and comrades, it is wonderful to be here. It seems a strange thing to talk about saving natural health. If we look at healthcare since the inception of the bipedal human being, the system that we're working against has been around for 43 seconds if we imagine a 24-hour clock. And in that 43 seconds, there is a plan that is all about patenting and control of healthcare and removing, alienating human beings from their rightful choices to nature, to look at natural products that can, including foods, especially foods, that are able to rebalance the body and allow self-healing mechanisms to be the predominant system of healthcare. And let me just contextualize it a little bit. Let me give you some examples. You're all familiar with the company Merck, one of the world's biggest drug companies. They currently have filed in 2007 6 patents for natural forms of folate. Folate is the chemical group to which folic acid that many of you, particularly if you're women and particularly if you've been thinking about getting pregnant, would have taken. And of course, you know, folic acid helps to reduce the risk of neural tube defects or spina bifida. What the drug companies don't want you to know is that the folic acid that they've been giving you is a synthetic form. It's a monoglutamate form. It runs through a completely different pathway in the body. What they really don't want you to know is that if you use the natural food forms of folate, the type that exists in green leaf vegetables and in meats, that are now in ever smaller amounts because of plant breeding, GM, if we take more of those sorts, we start to get some rather miraculous effects on some of the biggest killer diseases around, heart disease being right at the top of the list. And they've got 7 patents out to protect the natural forms that they have learned to produce in a laboratory. And when you read their patents, they actually go as far as saying that when you use the natural form, whether it's been through some sort of biosynthetic process or not, and you add it to some other nutrients, and those of you who've read the newspapers closely over the last couple of years, remember when the drug companies came up with the poly pill, with folate being an important contributor, then they control that too. You've heard the terrible headlines about vitamin E. You know, if you take vitamin E supplements, you run the risk of having a 5% increased risk of death. Do not go near them. And of course, they don't tell you that all the clinical studies that show that you might kill yourself more quickly with a vitamin E supplement have all been done on synthetic vitamin E, the type that are produced by the drug companies. Because when they discovered that Southern Europeans were living longer and having much lower risks of cancer and heart disease because they had a higher level of natural vitamin E in their diet, together with a higher level of carotenoids, the sort of colored pigments that we get in colored fruits and vegetables, they decided to create their own versions. But their own versions are simplified versions. Like so many drugs, they have side effects. One of them is death. So what they're trying to do is frighten you that don't go near that folic acid, and if you do, we will control it. Don't go near vitamin E. Don't go near beta-carotene, because we conducted further studies in the 1990s that showed that when you give high doses of synthetic beta-carotene to smokers and asbestos workers, they also may die more quickly. Those supplements can be dangerous. But of course, we have to understand that this is really a story about very large corporations against smaller organizations and what we call in Europe small to medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, a very fashionable term. SMEs actually in Europe actually control, ultimately, have a larger proportion of the GDP than the large multinationals, but they have so little power. But it's also a battle between natural versus synthetic, between patents and things that are natural that can't be patented. But mind you, Merck's trying very hard to do it. I just want to tell you very briefly where I started my journey. I have a science background. I have 3 degrees in science, and I spent the first part of my life working very much in the field of agriculture. These 2 towers may be familiar to some of you who've spent time in Southeast Asia, the Petronas Towers. They're built on a platform of oil, on petrochemicals. And of course, what we've seen is an agricultural industry that, again, deviated from its natural origins and moved down a petrochemical base, particularly in the post-war period, with the development of pesticides. And of course, we started to see a lot of fertilizers come into the market that were also deviating from the natural manuring processes and composting systems that had been used for centuries before that, creating a whole range of problems. And of course, what I've been, I was with Imperial College London for about 10 years, and in my 7th year of postdoctoral science, where we were very much working on sustainability of agriculture, I became more and more interested in what those of us who produce food are doing it for. We're actually doing it to keep people healthy, yet those of us involved in agriculture are spending precious little time involved with those involved in healthcare. What a peculiar discontinuity it is. And then, of course, I discovered this skywalk. I could start to walk between both fields and realize there were startling similarities between them. In many senses, you are still looking at an environment, whether you're looking at the external environment or the internal environment, you're looking at complex biological systems that interact with a genome, whether it's within the body or outside of the body. And the long and short of it, because we've only got an hour, we've now got less, is we can either work against nature or we can work with it. And when you look at sustainability, a concept that has now gathered a lot of interest and is changing the minds of policymakers because you cannot push upstream eternally in a world of limited resources, you have to start going downstream eventually. And that downstream has certainly started to happen on this side of the fence. We've started to see some semblance of a movement back towards systems that are more sustainable. People actually know what organic food is. People who eat organic food are not being discriminated. But let's be aware, the machinery is at work, and we're continually seeing a dilution of organic standards. But on this side of the fence, we're in the backwaters still. Complementary medicine, homeopathy, herbal medicine, the great ancient traditions of healthcare that involve the use of natural products combined with a whole array of mind, body, spirit balancing systems are severely threatened by this thing called evidence-based medicine. Very interesting, when you look back at what evidence-based medicine is, it was developed by a group of Canadians back in 1992, and they said what evidence-based medicine should be is something that takes the best out of the published scientific arena and combines it with clinical experience. And of course, what's happened, and some of you here will be rather familiar with Professor Edzard Ernst, who is just down the road after all, and Edzard, you may be here, I don't know. But he is a great believer in evidence-based medicine, but unfortunately what he's done is he's dissected off the clinical experience. And one of the reasons why there's so many people out there who are so passionate about natural health care is because they've had fantastic experiences. They don't mind how it's happened, whether it is a combination of psychosocial processes combined with placebo effects, combined with practitioner intention. They don't mind. They just want a result. And of course, what Edzard has done is said, look, we're just going to put a lid on what happens in the clinic. We're not going to listen to the fact that there are a whole bunch of herbal medicine practitioners, nutritional practitioners, and homeopaths out there who are on a daily basis seeing people through heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and all the other diseases that people are dying from increasingly more rapidly. No, we'll just put a lid on it because it suits them to do that. You'll all be aware that it's the big three that it's nice to keep things simple sometimes, isn't it? The big three: big food, big chem, big pharma. This is where it all comes from. And of course, we have things that are called foods coming out of big food that are creating the problem from a healthcare point of view. In Europe, you'll find that there are trade associations built up of the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry. They make good bedfellows. One produces the junk that makes us sick, and the other produces a system of healthcare that doesn't work, that poisons us, and makes a lot of money out of it in the process. And just to give you a feel for it, I recommend that you go and have a look at this particular website, BMJ Clinical Evidence. This is doctors talking about the efficacy of orthodox healthcare. And when you go on to the About section on BMJ Clinical Evidence, you'll find a pie chart that is updated regularly that deals with the summary of the 2,500 or so medical treatments that have been evaluated for benefit since they started doing this several years ago. And I know it's a little bit far away, but you'll see that the pie chart is divided roughly into two, with the very largest area for mainstream orthodox healthcare treatments being those of unknown effectiveness. Strange, isn't it? Because that's what we in the CAM field are always accused of, having things that are of unknown effectiveness. And there's a section that says 15%, and I apologize because a month ago it did say 15%. Interestingly, over the last few days, because of some further analysis, it's dropped further. It's now 13%, but it's only 13% of medical treatments that are shown to be beneficial. Okay, so all of that drug money, all of that advertising, all of that PR spin for something where round about half of all the treatments are of unknown effectiveness and only 15% are effective. Do you think people who queue up in their GP surgeries know that? It's the PR spin that creates the problem. So, how did our food originate? Well, this is up in Kitale in Kenya. I've spent a long time there. This is the place where actually smallholder organic farming within sub-Saharan Africa has its base. There are about 100,000 farmers that have been trained there over the last 25 years, and they can't get money because no one will fund it, despite the fact that there is a solution here for everyone. And in fact, the solution goes much further than that, because if we all got engaged with polyculture systems that were naturally balanced, we wouldn't have the problems that we have today. So And of course, we've seen this huge deviation from this to systems that are dependent on pesticides. And of course, we start to see increasing shifts to GM. And a lot of you have got this notion, because it's part of the clever game that's being played out, that Europeans don't want GM. I mean, we wouldn't be like the Americans and just accept it and have GM in foods that are not even labeled as such. But you've got to recognize that the whole process is slow. It's a slow process. Yes, you're still seeing the fact that 96% of us in Europe do not want GM, but if you could see the amount of trial plots in GM and the amount of real GM that's going into countries like Spain that are desperately behind it, it is pretty sobering. And this is just a list from the European Community's websites of the GM that is currently allowed in Europe. And again, you can't see much of it apart from perhaps read that there's one company who appears very strongly on this list, and it's called Monsanto. So, know your enemy. And of course, the other side of it is, what is GM? I mean, GM is just a manipulation that's been performed by humans. We are engaged in manipulations every time we look at pollination and plant breeding, for example. The difference with GM is you don't know what trait they're referring to, and you don't tend in nature to start finding maize plants mating, if you could excuse the expression, particularly from a biologist, with spiders. And of course, it's this peculiar hashing together of different genotypes in GM that makes it so frightening. And one of the worst elements of it is this concept of GURTS, genetic use restriction technologies, of which one of them is Terminator. There are round about 2 billion people on the planet today whose livelihoods are dependent on raising seed. If we take that away from them and force them to go back to companies like Monsanto to buy their seed, you have actually lost control for that 2 billion or so people, because they now have become dependent on Monsanto. And that's why we've got to understand, when we're looking at GM, what trait are we looking at, how harmful it's going to be, is it going to be moving in the direction of GERT? There's a fascinating discussion going on in Canada at the moment. There are organic farmers there up in Saskatchewan who've just lost a big battle with Monsanto and Bayer for the use of GM varieties of wheat. And the reason why it's so problematic is because once you get GM wheat into the midst of the organic farms, you get a contamination problem. And it becomes impossible to sell on that organic wheat. And in Europe, we hear a similar thing. We hear the European Commission saying, you people love organic farming. You hate GM. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to slim down the percentage contamination organic foods just to please you. At the moment, it's a horrible 0.9%. You don't want to be buying organic food that's got up to 0.9% GM in it, do you? So over the next few years, we're going to slim it down to a nice, cool 0%. Aren't we wonderful? Not telling people that if you do that and you still allow the growth of GM in Europe, it's going to be impossible to sell that food as organic. Okay? And we've got this, and this means more to those of us who live in Britain, but we've got the sort of Tesco-fication of organic food. And I think you'll know what I mean. We've got food that's turning up that's labeled as organic that shares very little with a truly sustainable agricultural system. In fact, they've dropped the term sustainability from it because it is non-sustainable. All it means is that it's met the limited criteria that keep on being diluted and diluted through Codex, in particular for international guidelines, so that they can avoid using particular pesticides and particular fertilizers, get the premium price for it, and call it organic. it is not sustainable. What we need to do is be promoting locally produced foods that are grown with true sustainable organic systems. And those tend not to be the ones that turn up in our supermarkets. There is no doubt that we've seen this dramatic reduction in the nutrient content of foods. In fact, that's one of the key reasons that I started to develop such a strong interest in human nutrition about 10 years ago through my research. The particular varieties of food that we're growing now are very different from those that we used to cultivate. You might notice that they don't taste particularly good. They taste quite watery. That's because they've got a lot of water in them. Strong tastes, bitter tastes, tend to include plant secondary chemicals, phytochemicals, that are cancer-fighting compounds. So if we eat bland food, bland yellow food, like so many kids today are being fed, it'll kill you even quicker. It's one of the reasons we're seeing obesity creeping into the youth. You may have heard just 2 or 3 weeks ago, we've had the American Society of Pediatricians coming out and saying, we think that statins should be given to kids over 8 if they're obese. Very strange, isn't it, when statins don't even cure obesity, so you can actually guarantee that you've got an open market there, probably for 50 or 60 years if you get them on it really young. Statins reduce cholesterol, and guess what? We know nothing about the effects of lowering a child's cholesterol when a child's brain is particularly dependent on cholesterol. And we've also seen that probably most of this stuff about cholesterol is absolutely a load of rubbish. So kids are becoming the new guinea pigs for the pharmaceutical industry so they can extend their market. And kids are certainly eating food that is pretty unhealthy. A good friend of ours, David Thomas, a geologist come chiropractor come nutritionist living in Forest Row, spent a few years distilling McCants and Widdowson, the UK government texts on the chemical composition of foods, looking at what's happened over the last 50 years. And he found a very similar picture in the UK, just this dramatic reduction in the amount of minerals that are found in foods. And of course, we've also seen this real problem in terms of fruit and vegetable intake. Not only are the fruit and vegetables substandard these days, they're also far too few in terms of diversity. The simplification of our food supply is a major health problem. But we also don't eat enough of it. On average, in the UK, men eat 2.7 portions of fruit and vegetable. Women eat, a little bit clever, of course, eat 2.9. Under 18s, according to the Food Standards Agency survey of 2003, consume less than 1 portion on average. So you can see there's a ticking time bomb going on there in terms of child nutrition. Now, if we could live to 100 years of age and keel over dead on the night of our 100th birthday, or some of us might want the birthday and then die the next day, wouldn't that be great? But unfortunately, life isn't like that. What happens is that typically we see that most of us will live a fairly healthy life until we're about 50, and then a catalogue of problems start developing. Particularly if you haven't looked after your health and you've given responsibility for your health to someone else that usually wears a white coat and has had no training on lifestyle, nutrition, or anything else. And I speak with a little bit of authority on this because my eldest son is at Cambridge University reading medicine. He's just finished his 2nd year. And he's completed his education in nutrition, and it lasted half a day. And it's fortunate that I'm his father, so he has other information to take with him. But quite seriously, if people don't choose to go out there, if the medical profession does not choose to go out there and educate itself about nutrition, and lifestyle, which are the acknowledged major causes of the 5 biggest killer diseases worldwide, then we've got a problem. The problem also is that the drug companies, incidentally, do love this concept of morbidity, sickness. This is where they make their money. They don't want you to die too early because otherwise they lose their market. And of course, with their partners in crime, the food industry, they're helping them to achieve this curve. They can go out there with their PR machines and say, isn't it wonderful? We're extending the lifespan of people by 3 or 4 years on average. Look what we've done. Yes, we've got people on life support system and it's burning our taxes. But the problem is that from a very, very young age now, people are getting sick, children are getting sick. And the responsibility cannot be with the orthodox healthcare system that is out there that's meant to be looking after them, because they're not even trained in it. The medical system as we know it today has been spawned out of the pharmaceutical industry. Most of the money in the research and development of technologies and protocols have come out of drug money. So the only way we can do it is to take responsibility for our health. And we've seen this transition over the last 100 or so years, movement away from infectious diseases to chronic diseases. And interestingly, our immune systems are now so badly suppressed that we're seeing a big resurgence of infectious diseases. And that trend is one to look out for. But still, cardiovascular disease and cancer remain the 2 leading causes of death. And it's interesting to know that even if you look at journals as accomplished, supposedly, as The Lancet and the Journal of American Medical Association, you will find that you cannot get away from the fact that orthodox medicine, in its own right, through errors caused in surgery and through the proper use of prescribed drugs, is either the 3rd or the 4th biggest killer in the Western world. Okay? So we're not doing too well. And you could argue, because orthodox medicine has got its eye off the ball in terms of dealing with the root causes of cancer and heart disease, you could say, well, orthodox medicine is responsible for the top 4 causes of death in the Western world. Here's some recent cancer stats to show you the picture. You'll see that most, whether you're a man or a woman, you live a fairly healthy life, but again, from about 35, 40, and particularly from 50, you start shooting into an exponential curve for cancer. The problem we have is at the moment the healthcare system is trying to expend all its energy at this part of the curve. And when you have a disease that is the result of chronic exposure to bad food and chemicals, you really need to deal with it much younger. It's one of the reasons we do have it in for the food industry a bit, because they've got a lot to answer for. What we need to do is we need to be taking real responsibility for our children, for the next generation, so that we can start teaching lifestyles that will reduce the risk. So we apply the education, the learning, the knowledge at a much earlier age so that we can impact this curve. And what we're doing is very much looking at the concept of sustainability within a healthcare area. If you go to our website, anhcampaign.org, you'll see a section on sustainable healthcare where we're really putting forward these ideas. Orthodox medicine is moving at 100 miles an hour towards a brick wall, and most people are very unaware of that. If you look at the different types of cancer, you'll see that male sexual organ-related cancers, prostate is the highest, same for women with breast cancer, but then colorectal cancer is right up there, being very strongly related to diet. Now, if we combine the fact that we are being exposed to a lot of xenoestrogens, for example, in our water supply, in our food, in the plastic that makes contact with so much of our food. And you combine the fact that we're eating such atrocious diets on the whole, these figures are not a great surprise. When you analyze the literature and you talk to the people engaged in healthcare from a holistic perspective, you'll find that there is general agreement in what you should be doing to maintain good health. And all of you are incredibly familiar with this, so I'm not going to go into it in any detail at all. But these are the things you need to do: mobility and exercise, diet and nutrition, hydration, get the toxins out of your life, deal with your stress, and control sources of electromagnetic radiation. And again, on our website, you'll find more information about all of these areas. But I just want to show you this to remind you how little information is available in Orthodox medicine in these areas. How little information your GP is likely to have in any of these areas. And so we wonder why there are such poor success rates. Even the World Health Organization recognizes this. In 2004, they established the Global Strategy on Diet, Physical Activity and Health, because they came to the conclusion, quite rightly, that the leading causes of death worldwide, through the big five: cancer, heart disease, obesity, osteoporosis, and have I got them all? I think so. Are all related to diet, nutrition, and physical activity. And of course, they've put in a policy that encourages governments to get involved with it, but we've seen nothing other than lip service to date paid to actually turning this into a reality. I talked about the simplification of our diets before. This is where we come from, and we now see what people are eating, especially the kids. We have 10,000 different species of grass that we know are edible, and yet 85% of the global trade is just 7 of them. There are 3,000 tropical fruits, and again, 80-90% of the global trade is just in 5 of them. In Europe, do you know that the laws on what shape and form fruits take are such that if a banana is less than 14 centimeters in length, it's not a banana. You can't trade it as a banana. And those of you who'll be familiar with the sort of bananas you get in Southeast Asia, pisang susu, for example, it's a very peculiar situation. In the legume area, the legumes that have got nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are vital in organic farming systems, and such an amazingly rich source of B vitamins and proteins and other nutrients, again, we just have around about 6 of them comprising the vast majority. More and more of them are being genetically modified as well. You'll see soya is one of the biggest ones. So dietary simplification is a major issue. And of course, I'd mentioned at the outset this issue between natural forms and synthetic forms of vitamins. This is the form that if you take this alpha tocopherol form, you actually suppress the absorption of natural forms of vitamin E in the diet. That's why you had a 5% increased risk of dying. Not because you're taking vitamin E, it's because you're taking the wrong form, made by the drug companies. Take it out of wheat germ oil, and it works a treat. Vitamin E was first identified in wheat germ oil. And how many people today get their vitamin E out of wheat germ oil? We've got to remind ourselves of the continuum of approaches to healthcare, from diet and lifestyle to use of nutrients and phytonutrients. Then, of course, you've got particular non-nutritional components that can be added, particularly botanical components. Then you have actual herbal medicine, where you move into the realms of, dare I say it, making particular health claims for your medicine. And then you have, obviously, the use of licensed pharmaceutical drugs. And again, how much attention is being given to all these areas compared to this one area? How much attention has the typical medical professional got in these areas? And of course, if you look at these areas, you can roughly divide them into two. You can look at those systems that work in harmony with the body's metabolism, that help to trigger self-healing mechanisms because we've somehow found ways of getting out of balance. Or you can look at those systems that interfere with them, that block particular receptor sites. And again, once we start moving into these systems, is it a surprise that we have such a problem with side effects? Because we're going against nature. Now, you've all heard the term codex mentioned on many occasions. Codex is used very widely to define the range of pieces of legislation and guidelines and standards that cover the whole area of food, okay? And within food exists products that we use for natural health. What I will remind you about is, just to be very accurate about this, Codex is just a particular part of the whole system that is being developed for international guidelines and standards. The legislative system that we face in Europe is actually straight old legislation that comes out of Brussels in the form of directives and regulations. And for those of us in Europe, it is those directives and regulations that actually are causing us to lose our freedom. It's very much part of boil the frog slowly, so it happens pretty slowly. I mean, many of you will be aware that the European Food Supplements Directive came in 2002. It came into force on the 1st of August 2005, but the real provisions within it that are going to make us lose particular ingredients won't happen until 2010. And also by 2010, we will be faced with new laws on the maximum amounts that we can have in food supplements. And they're using a system called risk assessment. We deal with risk assessment in every facet of our lives. And they're applying risk assessment that is born out of a toxicological model, a pesticide-type model, and applying it to nutrients. They've built the precautionary principle into it, which works wonderfully when you're dealing with Amazonian rainforests and polar bears and seals. But it works abysmally when you apply it to natural health. If we used the same system across normal foods, we would have to see complete bans on wheat, on dairy, on peanuts, and a whole host of foods, because we accept when those foods are sold that there may be a proportion of society that has some sort of intolerance to them. What they're doing now is they're not accepting any type of risk at all to any percentage of the population, and they don't care what the risk is. So take vitamin C, for example. The limit that is being contemplated for vitamin C is a crazy 225 milligrams. Why? Because when you build in a 2 or 3 times safety factor, because we've got to be safe, and you have someone take a single dose of 1,000 milligrams of ascorbic acid, some people may experience gastrointestinal upset. We're not looking at liver failure here. We're not looking at anything other than some bowel intolerance. And as many of you will know, it's actually a very good sign, and it changes from time to time. If you are suffering from an infection, you'll probably be able to take 10, 20 times more vitamin C than when you're not. We're looking at levels of selenium that are about the equivalent to that which you find in 1/3 of a Brazil nut. Okay? And we're desperately low on selenium. Ever since Europe decided under the Common Agricultural Policy to stop the import of Canadian and American wheat, which is naturally rich in selenium, and move to European wheat that has very low natural selenium, we've been suffering a selenium crisis. Margaret Ray from Surrey University has been desperately trying to find funding to look at the full extent of this in terms of cancer. She can't get funding. But she knows enough from our own self-funded research that there is a major problem associated with cancer caused by lack of selenium. And of course, there are differences in the type and forms of selenium out there. And of course, they're thinking of putting really nasty chemical forms like sodium selenite into white bread. And which one of us eats white bread anyway? It's a little bit like folic acid fortification. They're thinking of fortifying white bread. What a ridiculous message to put out to pregnant women. Eat the white bread and then miss out on all the nutrients in whole meal, cereals and breads. So the levels that are being discussed are outrageous. Beta-carotene from natural sources could be as low as the amount that you find in half a large carrot. This is a typical European directive. These are the things that actually do the damage, and you'll see they are framework. They start very silently, actually permitting trade. It's all about a combination of harmonization and consumer protection. And you protect consumers by letting them get precious little of it, and you harmonize by making sure that the likes of Merck and Centrum and Sanatogen and all the products that you see in your pharmacies and supermarkets are traded happily between member states. And it's great for them because they don't have to go to the trouble of relabeling and reformulating between 28 different member states. That's what it's all about. Now, we have actually taken the European Commission to court on this issue. We started a case in 2003 and completed it in 2005. And what we've managed to do there is achieve the thing that we first set out to do, and that's to make sure that they didn't use this as a system to ban natural sources of nutrients, because it's the natural sources in particular that are so vital to our health. Food supplementation, I believe, is an evolutionary adaptation to a food supply which is diminishing in terms of its nutritional content. Actually, we've been supplementing food as long as we can remember in history. It's always happened. What we've done now is sometimes we've been daring enough to put these nutrients in capsules that look remarkably like pharmaceuticals. And sometimes we can actually talk about the wonderful successes that we've been having when we take these sorts of nutrients in combination with a healthy and varied diet. And because of this knowledge, there is a system out there that's desperately trying to stamp out all talk and all access to these sorts of products. The Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation came out last year. It makes it an offense to make any type of claim for any health benefit of any food or nutrient unless it's approved. And the approval system is pretty complex. There were 42,000 health claim applications made in Europe last year, and they've already been culled down to 1,500. That's before they even get properly assessed by the European Food Safety Authority. We may end up with 500. Everything else, every other health claim will be banned. And these are not just health claims on product labels or on marketing literature. Health claims, according to the Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation in Europe, covers any form of presentation, including oral presentations, verbal presentations, including pictorial presentations. It's a remarkable infringement on our freedom of speech. And that's one that definitely needs to be challenged. Now, I've been talking about the European system. What I really want you to appreciate is that you've got these two levels. You've got international guidelines for food and nutrients working at the Codex level, and then you've got laws working through the regulatory instruments in different countries. One of the reasons European laws are so important is that they form the basis for what is going on in Codex. If you like, Codex is the system that exports the European model to other parts of the world. Okay? So, and of course, we're seeing now the health claims model, the food supplement model already in more or less identical forms appearing in Codex. And most Americans are sitting there saying, well, we'll be all right, you know. They would never allow something so crazy happen over here in the States. And yet, I sit there in Codex meetings, and I see the FDA officials there agreeing with absolutely everything that the European Commission is saying. You can barely put a cigarette paper between the two opinions. So don't be fooled into thinking that the American government does not want a European model. Last year, they also signed up for a cooperation charter with the European Food Safety Authority. So they are developing an international harmonized model. Codex is the system they use to do it with. In order to get the basic facts, I think all of you should have a sheet that looks like this on your seats when you came in. Codex Alimentarius means food code. It is basically intergovernmental. So you have 170 or so different countries taking part in it. But major corporations have a lot of influence. They do a huge amount of lobbying, and the bigger you are, the more powerful your association, the more influence you have. The basic idea is to have a system of global trade in food. So all these air miles type foods that appear in the supermarkets, all the GM foods that appear in the supermarkets, all of those low-dose vitamin and mineral products you see, they're all part of the same system of global trade, rules for the big boys. And of course, they put in this notion, we're doing it really to protect your health. You only have to look very closely to find that they're doing precisely the opposite. And of course, they also say, don't worry about it. Why are you getting so worked up about Codex? They're only guidelines and standards. They're not laws. But of course, they become the model for the legislative system. And that's why they're so sinister. And the other thing that's happening is that you're getting increasingly countries working together as trading blocks. Guess what? Europe was the first one in. And that means that at a particular Codex meeting, if you have, say, 15 out of 28 countries there, unelected officials from the European Commission can vote on behalf of all of us because they have been given power to vote for their particular trading bloc. So these are unelected people looking after our future and those of our children. Codex is built up of 26 committees, each dealing with different areas of the food supply, and decisions are made by consensus. And again, certain countries seem to have much more influence than others. And if you're a small country, imagine if you're Botswana and you decide to feel pretty strongly about the fact that particular herbs are being used and particular nutrients have been used for a long time, and you'd rather not get in on the pharmaceutical model, but your economy is dependent on the import of oil. You're a landlocked country. You need oil to be able to run all the vehicles and factories there. And of course, this is where the World Trade Organization comes into play. WTO acts as the big policeman to slap you on the back of the wrist. if you don't play the game. And this is why the largest countries, most powerful countries run the show, because the smaller countries dare not be out of step with it. A country like Europe, or I call it a country because it is a country now, has decided that it doesn't like genetically modified bovine growth hormone in its beef. The Americans have justified it to themselves that it's safe. The Europeans disagree. Do you realize that we pay $150 million a year in order to avoid American imports of bovine growth hormone beef? Now, that's only because Europe is wealthy enough to do it. If you're a smaller country, you cannot afford to pay the fine for refusing import of something that they say is safe. And you can see where I'm going with this. When you look at natural health products and they decide that the internationally accepted maximum levels or types of ingredients that are safe are X or Y, if you want to go on your own agenda and break away from that particular view, there will be consequences. And one of the consequences could be an arbitration panel, a dispute panel, the WTO. And if you're small, you're not going to come out well from it. And that is the real problem. Now, one of the joys of going to Codex meetings is seeing Rolf Grossklaas, who, I mean, basically Germany runs the show when it comes to the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses. Rolf Grossklaas is its chairman. The German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment are the party that provides so much of the scientific input. And they're the ones who tell us that only 225 milligrams of vitamin C and 5.4 milligrams of B6 and 2.25 milligrams of zinc are allowed in food supplements. And Rolf Grossklaas and his mates are trying to push this out into an international arena as fast as they can. But not too fast, because they don't want people to be too upset and they want them to get used to it. So we're looking at about 2012. That's an interesting date for many of us. And I actually could not help but smile when I heard 2 years ago that was the date that they thought that the Codex guideline on vitamin and mineral food supplements was going to be absolutely finalized with its risk assessment. So I don't think it's going to happen, because I think there's going to be such an uprising. But it'll only happen if every one of us gets engaged in this process. Thank you. You can go and check out Codex for yourself through the Codex, official Codex website, codexalimentarius.net. You'll see it was created in 1963. The primary purposes are harmonization of trade and consumer protection. They are looking out for us. And these are the sort of committees that you have. They all deal with things like contaminants and food additives and even fresh fruit and vegetable. They want us to have this limited feast of fresh fruits and vegetables. You're seeing increasingly in Europe now foods that have not been seen prior to 1997 falling foul of the novel foods regulation, because they're novel to a protectionist EU. And so a lot of tropical fruits with healing properties that are being brought in for health purposes are being slammed with novel food treatment. And we're very busy in different countries beating off these sorts of challenges, and have been successful already in 3 involving particular enzymes from fermented soya products and also mangosteen pericarp. We're now going to be fighting the German government on the latter issue. But these are the different committees. They all cover different systems. They all have this 8-step procedure that they need to follow, going through consensus. And the bigger you are, the more likely you are to get your opinion through. Now, this accession of the EU into Codex is a real concern. It happened in June 2003, where the Codex Alimentarius Commission amended its rules of procedure, allowing regional economic integration organizations to become members, thus opening the way to the accession of the European community alongside its member states. That's the process where unelected bureaucrats in the EU control our destiny through Codex. And it will increasingly be happening in other parts of the world, through ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, and of course, those of you who've been following the whole development of the free trade agreement of the Americas, we're likely to see it happening in America. And there's already a precursor to it in the Americas. That's the Trilateral Cooperation Charter, where they've defined health fraud now as the false, deceptive, or misleading promotion, advertisement, distribution, sale, possession for sale, which we haven't got a problem with, or offering for sale of products or provision of services intended for human use that are represented as being safe, my God, and or effective to diagnose, prevent, cure, treat, or mitigate disease. That's the area that they protect themselves in medicines, to rehabilitate patients, or to provide a beneficial effect on health. That's health fraud. There have been more than 1,000 prosecutions already since it came in 2004. And you can see this is exactly the same system that's being in Europe. The dots are being joined. The thing I just want to finish on is just reminding you what is happening with the media. You've seen all the stories. Vitamin pills, increased risk of early death. There is a huge PR machine out there trying to scare us away from natural health. All we need to do is understand where it comes from. All we need to do is recognize that the studies that form the basis are very limited and few and far between. In the meta-analysis that was used for these particular studies, they had to remove 484 trials to get the result that they wanted. And those 484 trials, you know what was wrong with them from their point of view, is there was no sign of harm, so they took them out. They took out the 0% mortality trials, and then they got the 5% result. So even that synthetic vitamin E isn't so bad. So please understand where this is coming from, and please understand that it mustn't worry you or concern you. What it might do is just put you off some of the pharmaceutical forms of vitamins that they're trying to harmonize globally. And this is just a concept to bring back this idea of bioequivalence and compatibility. The more we move to artificial systems of food, the more problems we have with compatibility with natural systems and our health. And it's patents that are driving that system. That's why it's such a concern to us that Merck are starting to patent this side. So far they've been busy over here, and we thought we'd leave them to their own devices. But if they try and patent this end, then we have a major problem. I think we've got 3 minutes?
1 minute. Really.
1 minute, there we go. Okay, well, I just want to hear the dots being joined, things that we've talked about. I want to just finish by taking you into this idea of sustainable healthcare, really taking the concepts that have already proven themselves of worth in the energy, agriculture, even tourism and construction, and let's take them into the healthcare arena. Check out our website in this area and realize this is the sort of language we now need to use with our policymakers. We need to start working with nature rather than against it. And we need to take responsibility for our health, and I'll just leave, finally, the sort of 10-point hit of how to work outside of the system and be healthy. It's all stuff that comes second nature to people in this room. And I want to say thank you very much.
Robert Verkerk, thank you very, very much. Excellent.
Oh.